Imagine being one of the greatest football players of all time and still having your legacy defined by something bigger than football. That's Larry Fitzgerald. For nearly 2 decades, Fitzgerald didn't just catch footballs, he built a reputation for discipline, humility, emotional control, resilience, and consistency. He finished his career with 1,432 receptions, more than 17,000 receiving yards, 121 touchdowns, and 11 Pro Bowl selections. But today, I don't want to talk about Larry Fitzgerald's statistics. I want to talk about the mind behind them. Because here's the fascinating question. How does someone remain excellent for nearly 2 decades in one of the most physically and mentally demanding sports in the world? How do you deal with failure? How do you handle disappointment? How do you stay motivated when you've already accomplished almost everything you set out to accomplish? And perhaps, most importantly, how do you become great without allowing greatness to become your entire identity? That's what makes Larry Fitzgerald's career such a fascinating psychological case study. Hello, this is licensed professional counselor Robert Bryan, and welcome to Faith Meets Psychology. One of the first psychological characteristics that stands out about Larry Fitzgerald among the many is consistency. And consistency is very different from motivation. Motivation is more of a feeling. Some days you wake up excited, some days you feel confident, some days you feel like you can go out and conquer the world. And then there are other days where you don't feel like doing anything at all. But for elite performers, they eventually learn something important. You can't build your life around how you feel. You have to build it around what you value. Larry Fitzgerald's career was built on showing up, preparing, working, and doing it again the next day and the next and the next. He didn't need to feel inspired every Sunday. He needed to be prepared, and that distinction is huge because greatness isn't always about doing something extraordinary one time. Greatness is often about doing something extremely well over and over again for years. Motivation might get you started, but discipline keeps you moving. And Fitzgerald's longevity is one of the clearest examples of that principle. Another major psychological strength for Larry was emotional control. Wide receiver is an incredibly emotional position. You're competing against another human being who's trying to stop you. You're getting hit. You're fighting for contested catches. And sometimes you spend an entire game running routes, blocking, and creating opportunities without getting the ball. That can be incredibly frustrating. And if your identity is tied to statistics, you can start thinking, why aren't they throwing the ball to me? But emotionally mature athletes learn to separate their identity from individual moments. A dropped pass doesn't mean you're a failure. A bad game doesn't mean you're a bad player. A game without a touchdown doesn't erase everything you've accomplished. And Fitzgerald consistently demonstrated that kind of perspective. His ability to stay composed allowed him to focus on the next play instead of getting trapped in the previous one. And that is emotional regulation. Emotional regulation doesn't mean that you don't feel frustration. It means frustration doesn't get to decide what you do next. Think about how powerful that is outside of football as well. Someone criticizes you, you lose an opportunity, you make a mistake, you have a bad day. You can't control what happened, but you can control whether that moment becomes your identity, or whether you take a breath and move forward. And for Larry Fitzgerald, he certainly experienced moments like that could have defined him. However, one of the biggest that he was able to overcome was Super Bowl 43. Fitzgerald had one of the greatest individual moments of the game when he caught a 64-yard touchdown late in the fourth quarter. Arizona took the lead, and for a moment, it looked like Fitzgerald might finally have the championship he'd worked his entire life for. But Pittsburgh answered, and the Cardinals lost. Imagine being that close to the ultimate goal and watching it disappear. You can't change the result. You can't replay the game. You can't go back and make one more play. But that's where resilience becomes so important. Resilience doesn't mean you never experience disappointment. It means disappointment doesn't get the final word. Fitzgerald could have allowed that loss to become part of a story that said, "I was never good enough to win it all." Instead, he continued his career. He continued performing. He continued showing up. And that's one of the most important lessons about resilience. You can acknowledge that something hurt without allowing it to determine who you become next. You can say, "That was painful." And then you can say, "But I'm still moving forward." Then there's humility. And this may be one of the most interesting parts of Fitzgerald's psychological profile, because humility doesn't mean thinking that you're not talented. Humility means you don't need your talent to make you feel superior to everyone around you. And that's difficult for professional athletes. The entire environment can reinforce ego. You're told you're special, you're famous, you're one of the best, and then millions of people can tell you exactly what they think about you. But Fitzgerald consistently carried himself with a sense of perspective. And psychologically, that matters because when your identity depends entirely on being an athlete, what happens when you're no longer an athlete? When the touchdowns stop, when the stadium lights turn off, when the cameras move on. That's why having an identity bigger than your profession is so important. Family, faith, friendships, service, community, character. These things provide psychological stability because they remind you that you are more than what you produce. Larry Fitzgerald simply wasn't Larry Fitzgerald, the football player. He was a son, a father, a teammate, a friend, and a person with responsibilities and values beyond the football field. And when your identity is bigger than your career can become something that you passionately pursue without becoming something you desperately need in order to feel valuable. Larry Fitzgerald also teaches us something powerful about leadership. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to be a leader. Some leaders lead with speeches, others lead with behavior. And Fitzgerald's leadership was often demonstrated through his example. His preparation, his professionalism, his work ethic, his consistency. Imagine being a young receiver entering the NFL and watching a veteran like Larry Fitzgerald prepare every single week. You don't necessarily need him to give you a motivational speech. You watch him and you learn. This is what a professional looks like. This is what preparation looks like. This is how you respond when things aren't going your way. That's called behavioral modeling. People don't just listen to leaders, they watch them. And sometimes the most powerful leadership message isn't what you say. It's what you repeatedly do. But eventually we have to ask another question. What keeps someone going after they've already accomplished so much? Because at some point, the external rewards aren't enough. You've made millions. You've been selected to Pro Bowls. You've broken records. You're already considered one of the greatest. But what happens when the applause isn't enough anymore? That's where intrinsic motivation comes in. Intrinsic motivation is when you pursue something because the activity itself has meaning. You enjoy the preparation. You love competition. You care about your teammates. You want to master your craft. And I think that's one of the biggest psychological lessons from Larry Fitzgerald's career. He wasn't simply chasing statistics. He wasn't pursuing anything beyond what was beyond excellence. And there's a major difference between asking, how can I become famous, and asking, how can I become excellent? Fame depends on other people's attention. Excellence depends on your own standards. And when your motivation comes from mastery, you can continue improving even when nobody is watching. So, what can Larry Fitzgerald's psychology teach us? First, consistency beats temporary motivation. You aren't going to feel inspired every day. Do the work anyway. Second, Emotional control protects your performance. You can't control every circumstance, but you can control your response. Third, failure doesn't have to become your identity. You can lose, you can disappoint yourself, you can experience heartbreak, and still move forward. Fourth, humility creates longevity. You can be confident in your abilities without believing that you're better than everyone else. And finally, your purpose has to be bigger than your achievements. Because eventually, every career ends, every record gets broken, every athlete gets older, and eventually the spotlight moves somewhere else. But the character you build, the people you influence, the way you treat others, and the person you become, those things can last far beyond the career itself. And that's why Larry Fitzgerald's Hall of Fame career is about so much more than football.